to welcome everyone to the first of the artist roundtable series as part of the exhibition Alone at Acadia. I'd also like to acknowledge that we are currently on, a virtual space, but we are on the land of Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. The territory is covered by the treaties of peace and friendship, which Mi'kmaq, Maliseet, and Patamasquatty people first signed with the British Crown in 1726. The treaties did not deal with surrender of lands and resources, but in fact recognized Mi'kmaq and Maliseet title and established the rules for what was to be an ongoing relationship between nations. So again, I thank you all for joining us in the Zoomverse this evening. Before we get started, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the kind of procedure and practices that we'll be doing tonight. So each artist is going to be talking about their work, about their process, and about their particular work in the exhibition. Then there'll be some time we'll all be asking some questions around the theme of the theme that we're going to kind of explore tonight, which is going to be art and memory, private and public. And then there will be some time for questions at the end. We are running this as a webinar, so it is being recorded for archival purposes. And so for those that want to ask a question, there's going to be a chat box for anyone that's attending it as an attendee. So you can ask your question in the chat box. And at the very end, there'll also be an opportunity if you feel really strongly and want to show your face to the world. I can also add you on video as well. So that's going to be the arrangement for the evening tonight, but we will save questions to the end. But I really want to thank all of you for attending out there in the universe. And I really want to welcome and thank all of our wonderful artists for speaking about their work tonight. I think that artist roundtables and artist talks are a really important way to kind of delve deeper into a work of art, but it's a bit strange, right, to do it while we're all effectively each sitting separate and alone. So that's a very, I think, different experience to the tactile element that an artist often gets to do, right, where we're normally standing in a gallery and in front of their work. So I really want to applaud the artists for agreeing to do this and kind of speaking about their work in this way. And so we will get started. I am not going to really introduce too much about the artists because they are going to be regaling us with amazing tales about their work and their process. So, but there'll be some time at the end where I'll delve a little bit deeper into their work. So we're going to begin first with Wayne Boucher. His work in the exhibition is Fare Thee Well, Nova Scotia from 2020. So Wayne, if you'd like to begin, that would be wonderful.
Thank you, Laurie. It's a great privilege to be part of this exhibition with these wonderful artists. It's just really an honor. And I just want to go back and talk about the work a bit, how it came about. I think artists are used to being alone, working in their studio. In my case, this came about because of actually a really good situation of our daughter, her partner, and grandchildren moving back to Nova Scotia from Ottawa before the pandemic and living with us. And anyways, one of the offshoots of living in a house with small children is they bring home a lot of sicknesses from pre-primary and daycare and this type of thing. So from October about 2019, I got pneumonia, and everybody in the house kept on getting sick because the kids would be bringing home these flu-like symptoms, colds, and everything else. So so our lives changed around quite a bit, and we called where we live Camp Run Amok because it's never quiet. Anyways, after living through this for maybe 4 months of repeating everybody being ill, I decided that, okay, we've got to try breaking the cycle. So I decided to go to my studio in Parker's Cove. and try breaking that cycle for 2 weeks. And I think this was in mid-April anyways, and the pandemic was just starting. I just remember there was a celebration of Jeff Butler at the King's Theater on March 8th. And I remember that after March 12th, everything sort of closed down, and it didn't affect me too much, but just being the threat of, COVID, being sick and trying to get well again. So I decided to go and self-isolate at the studio for 2 weeks and see if I could break the cycle. And that's what I did. The painting sort of came about at that time, and it was really working uh, in a process where I just start working on a piece. And in this case is I had stretched canvas on plywood. This is about 2 feet by 3 feet, this piece. And I did it with several pieces just because it was hard to get stretchers with canvas on and able to afford it. So what I did was start working on these pieces, and I just start working on them and see what would happen. And I have in my mind something to do with the Halifax explosion, something to do with darkness, because we seem to be entering a dark time and everybody seemed to be far apart. Anyways, I just started working on this, and I knew I was looking at Halifax explosion, things that had sort of stuck in the memory, and also thinking of a friend of mine, artist Richard Mueller's glass work, where he had done dark clouds, and I just wanted to do something with that in mind. And so I just started working, and I worked quite quickly in trying to get the basic flow and movement in the process of, I work with squeegees and oil sticks, and I don't use much paint, and I paint like a watercolorist. I paint wet into wet using alkyd resin and putting a bit of oil down and just moving. I paint with a large squeegee, and that leaves marks wherever I do. And if I like the marks, I leave them. And I have about maybe a day to change things and put marks in. And so all that stuff is done pretty well in the first day. Then things start to evolve, and I start seeing things in it, seeing movement and patterns. And what happened was I was working on it, and things changed. Our whole lives were changed in Nova Scotia because of April 18th and 19th, 2020, and the massacre in Portapique. And so that sort of changed the sensibility of the painting and working on it. What's this painting going to be about? And I think because of the pandemic and the loss of life, in Portapique, and this was a loss of innocence for Nova Scotia. This has never happened before. It was such a tragedy, and everybody's alone and couldn't grieve. They couldn't share their outrage at this tragedy. And so I think for me, it was a way of getting it out of my system. And so the painting is called Fare Thee Well, Nova Scotia, and it sort of relates to the dark song saying goodbye to Nova Scotia, but not in this case. I meant you want Nova Scotia to fare well. So that's the title, Fare Thee Well. And the Fare Thee Well becomes sort of the portal into the painting. And I started using a long time ago, I used geometric symbols and as counterpoints. And in the recent past, I've gone back to using signal flags, which I used about 20 years ago. And they just resurfaced as counterpoints into the painting. So this painting uses three flags. One is the red flag called Bravo, which means I'm carrying dangerous cargo. And Keep Well Clear being the other one is Juliet, which is similar meaning to it, carrying dangerous cargo, I'm on fire. And beside it in the right-hand corner is the word Portapique, which is acknowledges the tragedy of the burning, the fire, and everything else that happened that day. And in the upper right corner is the Nova Scotia flag going in sort of into the light. So there is, meaning there is hope in being alone. So that's pretty well what the painting is. It's about fire, it's about tragedy, it's about darkness, it's about coming out of the light. And so I think that's all I really have to say about the painting, unless you have any other questions about it.
Great. So thank you very much, Wayne. So I think we'll save questions at the end. So if people, though, do have a burning question now, please feel free to put it in the chat box because I'll look through them as we go. So we're going to go on now to our next image. Sorry, or our next artist as well as image. Laura Kenney is not an image, but I'm going to show an image of her artwork. So up next is Laura Kenney and her piece in the exhibition. And again, sorry if there's a weird bar on the screen. There's just a challenge with Zoom and PowerPoint this evening. Laura Kenney's work in the exhibition is called We Will Remember Them. It's a rug hooking from 2020. So Laura, we would love to hear about your process and your work in the exhibition. And thank you again, Wayne.
Hi, everyone from Toronto here. So before the pandemic hit, I was working on a series of rugs about climate change or addressing climate change, taking climate action. And then the pandemic came along and it was like, oh, what fresh crop is this sort of thing. So it totally changed. I tend to make rugs about current events. So my mind totally shifted to the pandemic, and I'd been making sort of more lighthearted rugs with Judy. That's the girl you see and the woman you see in the rug there. And so when I saw the call for submissions, I thought maybe I'm going to try something a bit more on the serious side. So, so Judy, I just want to give a little background about Judy. So she's the woman with the red hair, black dress and red boots there. So people often ask me, well, is she, you know, your alter ego? Is she a fictional character? Is she based on someone? And to be honest, I don't know. She came to my rugs about 8 years ago. I did a series of 3 rugs and it was the same woman. And I had this, it was bigger than a light bulb moment. It was like a eureka moment. I'm like, who is this? So I just had sort of like, whoa, I'll have Judy doing this, I'll have Judy doing that. And that was just the start of it. And it's been pretty intense for 8 years of Judy. So I wanted to feature Judy in the rug. And you'll see she's pulling away again with tombstones and crosses. And I think the thing, you know, obviously that was so heartbreaking about the pandemic was, you know, we hope for a good death. I know that sounds kind of, you know, strange maybe, but we hope for, like, you know, loved ones around and you know, not being alone and you know, a good send off, a good, you know, funeral service or whatever. And that was all taken away. So Judy tends to want to fix things. So she is in her way, she is helping that process, I guess. Yeah. And so you'll notice Judy and the tree are in the foreground. So Judy's either like really big or the tree's small, and that kind of quirkiness, it doesn't really bother me. That's the folk artist, I guess, or folk art that I really love. So, and plus Judy's bigger than life, so she's always big in my rugs. And then you also notice like the grass is green and it looks almost like a summer scene, but there's no leaves on the trees. And so that's another thing that so Maud Lewis, when she would have these winter scenes, she would have these green mountains in the background, and you're like, what is Maud doing there? And she used to have like evergreen trees with like these cherry blossoms, and I just kind of like that kind of quirkiness, so I left the leaves off the trees. And you can see the close-up on the right there. It's actually, it should be flipped, but that's Judy's leg. And so I use a lot of different materials. I use secondhand wool. So the red there is secondhand wool. And I use a lot of sari ribbon, yarn, roping, and those are the different materials that I put in there. But yeah, so it's an exciting time to be a rug hooker. Lots of cool things are happening. So yep, that's it.
Great. So Yes. Okay. So thank you very much. Sorry, it's hard. We're all in different places. I can't see people's gestures in the same way. So thank you very much, Laura. And again, if anyone has questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box, and we'll be sharing and talking about some of those afterwards, further with the artists. So the next artist whose work we're going to explore is going to be the work of Susan Tooke and a diptych that she has in the exhibition. And Lost on the Marsh, Hiker on the Marsh, acrylic 2019 to 2020 is the work that we're going to be hearing Susan talk about. Not this one. Sorry, trying to get this. There we go. Perfect. So Susan, whenever you are ready, we'd love to hear about your process in this particular grouping of works that are in the exhibition.
Okay, I'm ready.
Yeah, great.
Okay. So thank you very much, Laurie. And like as Wayne has said, it's an honor to be in this exhibition about Alone. The diptych came about as a response because of something that was really quite a tragedy in my life. It was the loss of my husband in November of 2019. The image on the right is called Hiker on the Marsh. I live in Port Royal, right at the base of North Mountain, and I can see the Annapolis River out my front window, and I can see the South Mountain. And in between our property and the Annapolis River is the Queen Anne Marsh. It is a favorite place for hiking for both Richard and myself. And the painting on the right called Hiker on the Marsh is a tribute to Richard that I did in the year before he died. Where I was thinking that I would often look out the window and he would be striding off to the marsh with great big strides, loved to hike out there, see all of the wildlife, all of the busyness of the river and the incredible skies that are formed over the Annapolis Valley. Is just phenomenal. And that piece, to me, apart from the sky, which is very animated, looks very calm in retrospect. I look at life around me and I have created symbols and a kind of abstracted way of viewing it. I think of life as a collapsing of time. And I think maybe because I'm a senior artist, that element of time is really always present in my work now. So Richard died, and it was before the pandemic. It was sudden, it was a shock. And we had spent, as two artists, living together, working together, collaborating, spending every minute, really, of our lives together for 15 years. It was a complete shock to me to no longer have him there. And I look around me, I look, at our house, in our house, outside, up in the woods, out in the marsh. And it's almost as if I tried really, really hard, I might be able to see him once again. So the painting on the left is called Lost on the Marsh, because I imagine that he's got to be somewhere, that he is somewhere out there. And in fact, he could be out down there on the marsh and just not visible to me. I painted this when we were going right into the throes of the pandemic. And I had come from being alone without Richard to sharing the aloneness with so many of our neighbors, and in fact, the world. So in looking at the painting, I see a very different kind of approach to it. It seems very aggressive in some ways, and perhaps angry and upset. And I had so many emotions running through me and such intense grief. And as I painted, the little red ball formed. Richard would often be hiking out with his red jacket, and I could see him from, like a kilometer away, out on the marsh, because you could pinpoint that bit of red. And you see it in that painting. It's curled into itself and isolated from all of the activity of life around it. A very angry, aggressive sky, and things welling up and just becoming chaotic. The paintings that I do are acrylic on birch panel, and these two are fairly large. But I think the fact that one is about that aloneness when we're out hiking by ourselves and thinking, and then the aloneness that's caused by the loss of a partner. I think that wraps it up for my talk there, Laurie. So.
Great. So thank you very much. And again, if there are questions about Susan's work, please put them in the chat box and we'll have some time to revisit them as a group at the end. So we're going to move on to our next artist, which is going to be Frances Dorsey. So I'm just going to switch to that work. Yes, so Frances, whenever the work switched and whenever you're ready, that would be wonderful.
Okay.
Oh,
So
I don't know. It's like PowerPoint's having this crazy party lately.
yeah,
Let's
it's just
try this.
rolling away.
Here we go.
Okay.
So, and then let me know when you want me to move to the detail. The detail's on a separate image, okay?
Okay, maybe
Perfect.
what you could do is just move it in about 2 minutes.
Sure, sounds great.
Or, a minute and a half or 2 minutes or something like that.
Okay, perfect.
Okay, I wanted to thank you for including me in this show. As Wayne and Susan and Laura have mentioned, it was thrilling to have the proposition of presenting work that related to the pandemic in a weird sort of way, because I think everybody was making work that was influenced by the pandemic in some way. So it was an interesting question. I work in a lot of different ways, and what it has in common is that I'm quite interested in the material qualities of cloth. I like it physically, I like the structure, I like conceptually what it represents, I like all of the symbolic representations of cloth. It speaks to me. So at the beginning of the pandemic, I had a number of projects on the go and I just couldn't focus. So I found myself down in my studio just moving little bits of cloth around and doing a little bit of watercoloring, and I reorganized my studio and I did all of this sort of busy work. And when I was reorganizing the studio, I came upon all of these little bits of cloth, and they were natural dye samples that were generated by students back when I was teaching. And the assignment was that they needed to choose a plant and then try a number of different kinds of material and a number of different mordants, and all of those were specified, and then make enough samples so that everyone in the class could have a sample of, say, alder leaves dyed on silk and linen and wool and cotton and rayon. And they always had to make more than enough because I knew some were going to be messed up. So at the end of the day, the rejected ones would be left on the table and I would just pick them up. So I ended up with this huge collection of these little kind of charming, you know, flawed objects. And I was moving them around and I thought, well, I could make a bigger piece of cloth if I started to sew them together, and it would be something that I could do with my hands, and you know, it wouldn't be too challenging, but maybe something would come out of it. And as I sewed them together, I started out in squares of 9. And as I was looking at them and sewing them together, I thought about how they looked like heads seen from above that were also separate. So they were all in the same space, but nothing touched except, well, of course, in some of the flaws, some of the mordant and dye leaked over into other things, but essentially they were supposed to be isolated from each other. And then I thought about how it would look if it were raining and the rain were coming down unevenly, because of course some people are getting no rain, like in Nova Scotia, we're getting very little rain from the pandemic, but in other parts of the world, they're getting a deluge. That's sort of emblematic of the way that I work. I'm interested in the material and I'm interested in an idea, and sometimes the idea comes first and sometimes the material is first. And for example, in the past, I worked with the idea of the Second World War based on my father's photographs and his notes, which he wrote down during his combat and afterwards. And then for a long time, I worked on the thought of the Vietnam War, which was the war that drove me to Canada and was doubly painful because I had lived in Vietnam for a number of years as a child. Excuse me. Then for years, I worked on an image of the moon rising sort of halfway out of the sea. And most recently, I've been thinking about the idea of sleeping in the forest and how that would smell and how that would feel and what it would look like. So generally, I start with an idea and then I just start moving materials around. It's a little bit more difficult on the loom because, of course, you have to pre-plan. You have to put a specific warp on that has specific colors and there's a specific weave structure, and you've got a limitation of size. But I like having a set of limitations and then setting up accidents and then trying to figure out what the accident is telling me about the idea and plugging on from there. So although this piece is not related to sleeping in the forest, other than that lots of the colors came from the forest plants, it sort of represents the way that a lot of the work happens. I think the idea of having a question that you're mulling over and then setting up accidents and then having to deal with the accidents is very appealing. And of course, in this time when we're all alone and in our studios, there's been more than enough time to just sort of move stuff around and respond to it. And I think that's about what I have to say.
Great, thank you so much, Frances. And again, please feel free for those attending this most exciting session on the computer tonight in the chat box so we can revisit your questions at the end. So the next artist that's going to talk about their process and their work in the exhibition is going to be Basma Kavanagh. This work is a durational textile, and I'm sure they'll speak to that. And it's called Isolations from 2020 into 2021. So Basma, whenever you are ready, that would be wonderful.
think I'm as ready as I'll ever be. Hi, everyone, and thank you, Laurie. It's a pleasure to be part of this, and really a pleasure to hear from everyone about their process and about these artworks. For me, the last few years, art making has become quite difficult. I sort of put my writing to the forefront, and in terms of making visual art, I found it's actually really reassuring to hear Frances talk about her process, because I was doing a lot of cutting things into pieces, moving them around. I work with print, I work with paper, I work with textiles, and a lot of the time it didn't really feel like anything was turning into anything that I felt excited about. And so sometimes a strategy there would be a little bit like what Frances described. I would sort of set something up and then just have to see where it would take me. So I had been doing a lot of stitching prints that I had made. I would cut prints and collage them and then sew things together. And these were all kind of experiments that didn't feel terribly fruitful, but there's still something there that was kind of compelling me. When I saw the call for this show, I thought, great, I know about being alone. And I had this fairly clear and in some ways very literal image that sprang to mind of these positive and not so positive facets of being alone. So, you know, even the word isolation, it can be really maybe a cozy feeling to be isolated, but it can also be painful if what you want is actually to not be isolated. So this piece was a bit of a departure too. At first I thought I might be able to print the large letters. I have some wood type that I use in printmaking. That didn't really work. I was able to get just enough ink onto the fabric that I was able to trace it with stitching. I'm using some new techniques, new to me, of printing the type, the text, and then stitching through the paper and tearing the paper out of the way so that I have an outline that I can work with. And it's been a really interesting process because, of course, there's some planning with composing the colors and where the different words are going to go. But then in terms of there's a sort of free embroidery in the background as I go that it can be really intuitive, either, you know, using contrasting colors or complementary colors. I really like surfaces where things are both sort of emerging and disappearing at the same time. And in terms of the content of this piece, there'd been a lot of stuff that I'd been mulling over between, you know, figuring out how to continue to be an artist, especially last year when it felt like every opportunity just sort of vanished. I had written a book recently about my Lebanese heritage, so I was thinking a lot about the language and memory and ancestors. And then, of course, pairing that with my reality of being an artist working in rural Nova Scotia. So I thought it was interesting that, Laurie, you drew out this notion of memory, private and public, in these pieces. And I wanted to read a little, like a few lines from Anne Michaels. She writes that in art, the function of the personal is not to lead the viewer to the artist's life, but instead to lead the viewer, the reader, the listener into her own life. That is the difference between confession and art. I know one thing I've found in some of my process lately is really wondering, you know, what is it that I can make that can actually speak to someone else, but also to trust that something that's compelling to me is hopefully going to be compelling in some way to a viewer as well. And I guess finally, I was thinking about this pandemic and just wanting some kind of comfort, and ended up thinking that a quilt was like a very comforting thing. And it's really fascinating how many textile pieces have ended up in this show, and that I think there is something here in Nova Scotia in terms of what textiles kind of convey to us, that definitely communicates beyond, you know, what I'm putting into the piece, or Francis or Laura. Thanks.
Great, so thank you so much, Basma. And as same with the other artists, if you do have questions about Basma's work or process, please put them in the chat box. What I'm going to do now is stop sharing the images. You're going to see all of the lovely artist faces on the screen. I'm going to ask them a few questions, and then we're going to have some time as a group all together to take some questions from the audience. So let me just switch out here. Okay, perfect. Great. So I'm just going to start with some general questions. And actually, it was really beautiful, Basma, what that kind of poetry that you read, but also that you commented on the connection between your work. So the connection that I saw, and I think one of the things that I always find for me as a curator really fascinating working with artists is the conversations that happen amongst works that are kind of unintended conversations, right? Because artists are often working, as many of you have commented, already in isolation, right? Typically most artists are working within their own artistic practice and within their own studio. That's somewhat of an isolating process. And so I always find it exciting to see the conversations, once the pieces in this case are virtually installed, other times in a physical space, and what happens kind of within that. And so, I was thinking, when I was looking at your 5 works, this connection between, memory, both public and private. And for me, there were some really interesting kind of elements. So I was thinking, in the case of Wayne's work, memorial, both in terms of, what was happening in his family, but also the Nova Scotia attacks on Portapique, and this idea of, do we grieve publicly or kind of do we grieve alone, right? And how is that process kind of grief kind of gone through? And then, when I was thinking of Laura's work, particularly in, this, the superhero figure of Judy, but pulling this kind of wagon that we would often associate with kind of childhood, particularly that red colored wagon, but then filled with tombstones, right? And so it was making me think a lot about that. And I was really particularly struck by Laura Kenney's artist statement about how, during the pandemic, everyone keeps saying we're all in this together. And I was really appreciative that Laura, really pushed back on that statement, right? And that we really need to be mindful that, yes, we're all in a pandemic, but we're experiencing it so differently, right? And as Laura has stated, we're all in different boats, right? And so that experience is quite different, and to be kind of mindful of that. And then I was thinking a lot about Susan's work, both in, her own personal grieving, but the experience that landscape plays in memory, right? And how, being in a space also helps to trigger memory of that. And so I think her diptychs to me are quite powerful in that. In terms of Frances' work, I was thinking about, this idea of, memory, both, she was talking about how a lot of the dye samples came from her experience as a teacher of students, right? And that experience that would be happening, and that conversation and exchange and sharing that during the pandemic is quite difficult, right, to do. And then in Basma's work, I really was struck tonight how she was talking about how isolation, depending on one's perspective, can be both cozy but also painful, right? And likewise, how we're processing memory, right, and grief can be a positive way in which we work through it, or it can be this other process. So this is a wider question for kind of all the artists, and so for those that would like to kind of weigh in, I'm curious what you think about this relationship between art and memory, and how does art help us process say grief, or how does art help us process memory? And again, both public and private, because all the artworks that we've looked at today, some are quite personal. I mean, they're all personal, but others take more of a public role as well. So I'm just curious, as artists, how you feel artwork, might serve that conversation or serve that idea.
I'll chime in there. It was interesting for me today and interesting that it was just today that I was looking at the pieces and thinking about how they were responses to memory, both memory and to grief, but that artwork is created over time. All of these pieces that we have made are created over time, and because of that, certain elements of our emotions come through. And I think in each case of the artists that we are looking at tonight, I think that is evident that their memories, but also their reactions over time have been recorded in their artwork.
Sorry, I'm unmuting. Is there any of the other artists that would like to kind of weigh in? If not, that's fine. I have lots of questions. Yeah, Francis?
I think a lot of making practices are really about processing stuff that happens in your life. I know that for me, I never know what to think about something right when it happens. And I just have a slow brain. I have to mull it over. And the way that I mull it over is using my hands often. And it takes me a long time to figure out what I think about something. And I think that the work that I make is always a reflection of some kind of experience that I've had, or a conundrum, or an ongoing dilemma that I'm trying to resolve. Whether it's, for years I worked with World War II imagery, sort of processing my father's life and death as he would be diagnosed now as having PTSD, but it made for a crazy growing up period, an interesting growing up period, but crazy. And I couldn't really get a handle on it until I had sort of made work based on images of him and text that he wrote about his experience in combat. I think for a lot of artists, they're just chewing over parts, maybe all artists, they're chewing over their lives and trying to find a way to make sense of it and come to terms with it and accept it and move forward.
Great, thank you. So perhaps I'll ask one more question, and then Wayne, yes?
Yeah, I just want to add to that. Yeah, this is a different time for all of us, I think, and looking at the work, and I just had a question from Anthony Clementi's in the show, and the question had to do was Turner an influence of my work, and I just wanted to say yes, it was, but I think I'm looking at the work at all these works, all these artists have done are really wonderful, but they also offer a sensibility to their own spirituality, and looking at the work that it takes you somewhere else beyond what the work it actually is. So, I'm glad that I went into the archives, read about Laura's work, Francis's work, Basma's work, and Susan's and Christopher's work. It was really interesting to go and get the inspiration behind the work and how it came out in the end.
Okay, so I'm going to ask the group of artists one more kind of question, and then we will, as I said, encourage the lovely participants to ask questions in the chat box afterwards as well. And I'll talk a little bit about that for people that want to also share their face. We can do that too. So the question I have, and this actually links a little bit to one of the comments that Francis was just noting a couple minutes ago. And one of the things that I also think is an interesting kind kind of connection through the exhibition in your works, but also other works in the exhibition. But I want to kind of link it to this, again, back to this idea of art as memory, both private and public, is the role that abstraction plays in that, right? Because quite a lot of your approaches in your work is kind of abstracting this notion of memory or this notion of, you know, place. And so I'm just curious, as artists, you know, what role do you think abstraction plays either in your work or abstraction in a wider way to kind of, you know, help us cope or unpack and process things? What role do you think abstraction plays?
I'll just give a brief answer. Yeah, I just try to, you're talking about extraction. When I try to work, I'm trying to work with an empty mind. And, you know, I just try not to think of anything else and just do it and see what happens. And I think Francis mentioned accidents, and I think accidents are very important to make the best of them when they do happen in a work. And I make a lot of accidents, but anyways, I try to make the best of them. And so you're extracting everything is in yourself. You are just a bank of information, and it all happens to come out no matter what your intentions are when you're trying to do the work. You just have a response to how you were responding to your work and your own memory, basically.
Great. Susan?
You know, that's interesting, Wayne, because I know when I'm working on a piece and my work has become abstracted, whereas years ago it was social realism. Now it is more expressionistic. Sorry, I have a hard time saying that word. But that emptying of the mind, trying not to think about anything is something that I also do when I'm working. I want it to be beyond words. I don't want to be talking to myself in words. And quite often, if I would naturally or be inclined to go in one direction, I will stop and intentionally do the opposite to see where I end up. So I think when we're working on a piece, we're all exploring, we're using everything that has come to us in life. And that is expressed probably in at least in my case, much better through abstraction.
Great. Francis, yes?
I think also literal representation can be confining, and a lot of the work that speaks to me most profoundly is really emotional, and unhooking specific images from that emotion seems important. It seems when you're working, you're emptying your mind, but you're often filled with feelings of some kind. And I think abstraction is a natural consequence of trying to get above. You're looking for what's specific in the universal, but then you're trying to find out what the universal component is. And that's often, you don't get there until you sort of abstract the literal, first step.
Great. Thank you so much. I feel like this is such a blessed conversation. To me, it's really exciting to have, this many artists together sitting around a virtual table, talking about their work and talking about some of these larger kind of ideas and structures. So what we're going to do now is move on to some questions from the participants. So there's two ways for those attending the webinar to ask questions. As I've noted earlier, you can put them in the chat box. So I'll be going through the chat box and I'll read some of your questions out loud for the artists to respond and engage with. The other option is you can use the raised hand option on your by clicking on your Zoom, and it'll show me on my end and I can allow you to speak. So for those that want to use their video or their voice, that's an option as well. So I'm going to start first by taking a question in the chat box, and then I'll go, because I know there's someone that has their hand raised, and so we'll go to that person next. And I'll do my best to go back and forth between the questions and the artists. The chat box will also archive itself. So if there is a question that we don't get to this evening, we can revisit it later with the artist and share it, through our gallery channels as well. So I'm just going to go up here. I think there was a question initially about which Wayne already addressed, which was from Anthony Clementi, talking about if Turner's Slave Ship was one of your influences. So Wayne has addressed that. So I think Wayne, do you want to add anything more about Anthony Clementi's question about Turner and the Slave Ship, or shall we move on? You need to unmute. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not only Turner's work. I think it's everyone that's gone before. All the artists that have influenced you. Could be Mark Rothko, the same sensibility that I get from a Turner's painting of the unspeakable. I'll call it the unspeakable because it's very hard to put in words, because it's a visual art, and as Francis says, it deals with emotion and the essence of a being that is commonly shared by people but can't be expressed. So, and I get that from Turner's painting, Mark Rothko painting, and Jackson Pollock, and any other painting that I can think of that I like.
Great, thank you. So there's a question here, and this question is for Francis. And I'll read this is from Pamela Swainson, and she notes that I appreciate sharing of the lostness we all felt in the early days. People were social mediating, how they were using the time to do stuff, and some of us could only absorb. Somehow you were able to get your feet under with what was the detritus left by students in the before times. Can you speak to how you were able to keep moving, find a way to respond?
Yeah, I was totally freaked out by this whole thing, and people were doing stuff and I was doing nothing. And finally I thought, well, I was walking the dog. And finally I thought I need to clean up my studio. So I did that, and I came to those little pieces. And, I guess one of my kids lives in Montreal, which is not a great spot to be. And she and her husband were constantly on my mind. And another of my kids is a paramedic in Ontario, and his partner is a respiratory therapist. So I was working really hard to not let my mind go to, especially in the early days when we didn't have a clear sense of just how dangerous the virus was. I felt like the only thing that I could do to help them was give them nothing to worry about, so that at least they didn't have to worry about us. And so as I was cleaning up my studio and came upon the student work or the rejected samples, I was really thinking a lot about, I was feeling, this is awful to say, I was feeling really glad that I was retired and that I was no longer trying to teach intermediate and advanced die-in print processes that are very equipment heavy and studio heavy that students could not do online. And I was sort of thinking about the leavings that you have after a career of teaching, what are you actually left with? And what you're left with, you know, are all of these wonderful students who stay in touch and they're doing incredible things. And, you know, it's sort of an ongoing confirmation that maybe it wasn't all pointless. But you've also got these little odds and sods that somehow it seems really important to be respectful of. So I think that I kept moving because I didn't want my kids to worry about us.
Thank you very much. And thank you for that question in the chat box. We'll move on to another question that one of the attendees have asked. This is a question for Wayne. And then we'll move on to some other questions and also give some opportunity for the artists, right, to ask each other questions as well. So this question is for Wayne Boucher from Mark Slip, and he talks about the connection between the Halifax explosion and the tragedy at Portapique shows through very clearly in your piece, Wayne. From my point of view, the engagement isn't as direct in most of your paintings, other than being submerged in water, exclamation mark. How did you make the leap from Portapique to 1917 in this fair land and sea?
Well, that's a good question. And I think lately I've just been trying to be a bit, go all out a bit more, put as much information in if needed to be more specific or absolute about a particular work and what it means. And so in that case, beside the flag Juliet in the bottom right-hand corner, I wrote the word, or I used a stencil and put the word Portapique in, just to give it a reference to Nova Scotia. And also music has a big influence too, like the mountains dark and dreary be from the song Fare Thee Well, Nova Scotia. And so it's just a different take on the semantics of Fare Thee Well, Nova Scotia, and also trying to be a bit more specific and using anything in your arsenal as an artist that you can use to be more specific about a particular work, what its meaning is, and as a portal into the abstraction of the work. Does that help?
I think so. I know we can't see people's facial expressions. I'm wondering, I have, again, lots of questions. I think we'll probably spend maybe another like 10 minutes because I know people can get tired being on Zoom. And for those participants, thank you so much for this evening. So I'm wondering if any of the artists have questions about other artists that are in this roundtable this evening. Susan, yes? Oh, I couldn't tell. Sorry, I thought I saw your screen go on.
Oh.
Okay, well, I'll ask a question. And this is about, well, I have several questions, but the one that I want to ask is pertaining to textile and the textile tradition in Nova Scotia, right? Both in terms of, you know, textile mills as an economic kind of producer in the province, but also when we think of like folk traditions, right? Like rug hooking. It was not planned to kind of put the 3 textile artists in there, but there are other textile works in the exhibition. So I'm just curious about and again, any artist can speak to this, but why do you still think today in a contemporary sense, the textile tradition in art making in Nova Scotia is so strong and so pervasive? Because I think it's a really important part of our creative expression in this province. And I think the 3 of you are taking some aspects of the tradition of textile making, but using it in a very contemporary way, in a contemporary language. So I'm curious if any of you want to speak to that as textile artists and textile kind of tradition within this province. Laura, yes?
Yeah, I better take that one. So I think in Nova Scotia or all of Atlantic Canada, I think when people think of rug hooking, they think of the mats on the floor, like the welcome mats, the florals, the geometrics, the sort of traditional ones that, you know, maybe grandma, great grandma, moms would make. So they're familiar with rug hooking. So when you, and I just find it kind of interesting, like when patterns came out, like if they never had patterns, like what would my grandmother was a rug hooker, like what would she have put on the burlap? And so every time I sort of draw something or create a rug, I'm thinking, you know, it's and you know, like it's really changed since I started in 1998. Like I noticed there were more women doing just the patterns, and now there's a whole bunch of hookers out there that are you know, taking the burlap like you would a piece of, like a canvas, and so there's that connection to the past, but then there's, I mean, I don't know why it can't be, why we can't talk about anything in a hooked rug. So that's exciting to me, and I think it's just, I don't know, yeah, I guess it's that, and it's the comfort thing that Basma said, you know, the quilts, the hooked rugs, it's that comfort of home and with it. So you know, it's fun to take something comforting and then do a twist with it. Yep.
Basma, yes.
That's really interesting, Laura. And I think for me, and maybe for other people who work with textiles too, I feel like they're very accessible and familiar. And there's nothing sort of stopping you from going to, you know, a secondhand store and finding really affordable fabrics, and you can work really small or you can work quite big. And there are like vernacular and folk traditions, but you use all the same tools if you want to approach things in a more contemporary way. So I just think it's something that sort of, I mean, it's a corny pun to say it's in the fabric of the culture here, but I think it is. And I know for me, sometimes access is an issue. And I think there's something maybe for female identifying artists as well, where it's like, maybe mom taught you some things, and so then you are equipped with some skills that you can then use to express yourself in any sort of way, and it doesn't feel alien or too cosmopolitan or elitist or any of the things that might sort of get in the way of someone feeling like they can have an artistic expression.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Basma. Francis?
I think also cloth is subversive. You know, it's sort of women's work, and it's never, it still isn't valued relative to a number of other media. And I think that makes it, anybody can work with cloth, and cloth is everywhere. And if you are working with cloth over time, you can become highly skilled, and it's eloquent. It's an eloquent material, and it's already got, there's content built into it. So whatever you do to it, it's already loaded. And I think that's very interesting to work with a heavily loaded material.
Thank you very much. There is one question in the chat, which I'll kind of address at the very end in my kind of closing remarks, but I'm wondering if there are any other further questions in the chat, or any questions that any artists might have. I have so many, but I will save them for the moment. Any questions? Okay, so I don't know, artists, do we want to have one more question, or should we wrap up? What do we think? What does our group think here?
Sure, one more.
One more. Okay, so so I'll ask one more, and then maybe if there's another question in the chat, we can address that. And then I'll, and again, there is a question here from Mark to me, but I'll address that at the end so we can give the platform right now to the artists. So one of the things that I been thinking about a lot in the exhibition is this question of scale. scale is kind of lost, right, in a virtual format because we can't always tell the size of works. But I was more thinking about scale. Each of you approach scale in your work in a really interesting kind of way, right? So Laura was noting earlier, you know, the scale, say, of Judy next to the tree, right? Or, you know, the way that Susan approaches scale in her landscape and the abstraction of that. Or Frances talking about, you know, maybe the dies represent kind of heads in kind of different ways. Or Basma's kind of use of kind of text through these kind of hanging odes, and as Wayne has talked about as well. So I'm just curious, as artists, how you approach this question of scale in your work, and how that impacts, you know, when you're representing, you know, representing an idea or exploring a theme. How does scale come into play?
I think the pandemic has changed things a bit. Where artists and other creators are seeking different ways of creating visibility and profiling the work. And in many cases, you don't really have to work big. You can use various like online venues like Empty Space or Step One, I believe, and put your work into it. And it doesn't matter how big you make it. I've been working with small works 4 by 4 inches and 8 by 10 inches and blowing them up to bigger sizes, 5 feet by 8 feet, into gallery situations. And what it does allow me to do is see the work in a bigger context, but I can do it in a smaller, you know, I don't have to make big work. And anything you do these days should be able to fit in a car. I've learned that lesson.
Does any of the other artists have some thoughts about how they explore scale? You know, with
I will.
Susan?
Yeah, it's interesting that the two pieces in Alone are landscapes, and they're kind of laid out in a fairly recognizable way that you can see that you can understand them as landscapes. But something else that I do is I work with something I call groundscapes, and that is looking down or looking at microscopic imagery and coming up with symbols that will create life based on things that you might not typically look at as having life, things as stones and sticks and layers of earth and various things that you can find in the swash zone at the beach. And so I think that looking microscopically and then looking on the grand scale and playing with an interchange of those two ideas is a way that I find really interesting in dealing with scale.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I think I will wrap up, and I'm going to address one of the questions that came in the chat box earlier, and I'll read it out. So it says, Laurie, this is a fascinating way to open an exhibition. Once the pandemic has passed, if it ever does, do you think this experience will become more of an aspect of arts openings? It seems that there's access to the whole planet in this way. And then there were some other comments in the chat from people being able to access this, right, from other parts of the world and other parts of Canada. So I just want to kind of address that also as a way to kind of wrap up the first of our artist roundtables. So for those attending the event tonight, this is part of an exhibition, right, an online exhibition called Alone at Acadia. There's a virtual exhibition that tries to virtually simulate the experience of an installed exhibition. There's also an archival site that includes artist statements, details of the work, studio processes where you can delve closer and deeper into the artist's work. And then we're also doing a series of roundtables. So this is our first roundtable. So all of this information you can find by visiting our website, gallery.acadiau.ca. So you can find all of that component material there. So your question is, and it's been interesting because this has come out through the opening and through other emails that I've been getting about people, you know, it doesn't replicate the same as a tangible experience, right, that we have with artwork and we have within that space, but it does expand access for that. One thing that I will say, which as an experience as a curator, is I would say moving things into a virtual realm is way, way, way more work than doing it in the physical space. Navigating completely within a virtual realm through all the social media channels and really working in those virtual elements is a lot of work, but I think it's really important. I think it really increases access, but when I think about museums and gallery spaces moving forward, you know, I've talked about this before, in the same way that we need to be funding and supporting our artists, we need to be doing that to our cultural spaces, because you need to have, you know, to really do this fully moving forward, you have to have some dedicated staff that are working on all the digital support, right, for museums. And you see this at really large institutions, but I think that's something for smaller ones to explore. So my hope is to continue to do some component of virtual access for the gallery moving forward, but it all just depends on kind of scale and feasibility. But for me, it's been really exciting to work with artists in this way, but it's been also really strange. I'm used to going to artist studios. I'm used to being able to, you know, touch their artwork, and even doing an artist talk in this format is a different kind of experience. So I want to thank everyone. I'm just going to check to see if there's any last comments. Okay, so there's lots of saying thank you in the chat box, and I really want to congratulate and thank all the artists for giving us their generous time and energy and thoughts tonight. It's a real gift to have your works in this exhibition. And so thank you also to the participants out in the land somewhere. Yes, so thank you very much. I'm now going to end the meeting. I don't think there's any, is there any final comments? Oh, Wayne, yes? You just need to unmute.
Yeah, I keep on forgetting. Thank you.
Oh, okay, perfect. We're good, yes? Okay, wonderful. So thank you all. And a reminder that our next roundtable, the theme for that is going to be imprints of the body, and that's going to be on March 17th. But please do encourage people to visit the space and, you know, spread the word. I think this is a really exciting exhibition of 18 Nova Scotian artists that I think are doing some really exciting work in the province right now. So a little bit of a glimpse on this moment in time. So thank you so much. I'm now going to stop the event and have a wonderful evening.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.